no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, UnSpun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to UnSpun today. UnSpun, because you deserve the truth.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome back to the UnSpun Journal Club. In this series, I break down newer research on journalism and misinformation. This week's paper is called Local Journalism as a Mitigation Hub for Misinformation, and it's by Greg Perot and Phoebe Morris. The premise is that local journalism may be one of the most effective tools we have for pushing back against false information, and the authors go through a couple of what we would call case studies, specific examples as a way of making their point. The first one starts in a situation that could be easy to overlook because it's the kind of small thing you see every day. In February of last year, in Boone, North Carolina, there were these posts online that claimed that ICE was doing raids in the area. To help the readers understand Boone, the authors describe it like this. Boone is a small, idyllic town in southern Appalachia, USA. The home of Appalachian State University and the global aid nonprofit Samaritan's Purse, it is a culturally progressive town inhabited by a long-standing, mostly white Appalachian population. So, as you can imagine, these posts about ICE resonated with people in the local community. On Instagram, there was a post that said ICE is doing raids in Boone right now, and it was paired with the siren emoji. At about the same time, there was also a thread on Reddit with a single word as its title, ICE. And under that, people started asking questions. Where was this? What road was it on? What time was this happening? What kind of vehicles should we be looking out for? These posts were interesting because of what they said, but they're also interesting for what they didn't. Because you might notice that the posts themselves were not very specific. They didn't confirm locations. They didn't really give any verifiable details. But even though they were super vague, they still spread around. If anything, when a post doesn't give information, people fill in the blanks with their own, and a claim like this would have spread because it just feels like it could happen. There's already been a lot of attention nationally on immigration enforcement. At the time that the post showed up, there had just been the presidential inauguration, and there were promises that there were going to be mass deportations starting immediately. And so, in that context, that kind of message doesn't really feel out of place. It definitely could be happening, except it wasn't. There were not any ICE raids in Boone at that time. Now, Boone has a small newspaper called the Watauga Democrat, and for them, like any news outlet, they're now in a little bit of a tricky position. So you've got this story, right, and everybody's talking about it. People have real fears, and it does seem plausible because it relates to stuff that's happening elsewhere. But also, it's not true. So as a news outlet, what do you do? Now, why would I say this is tricky? Consider this. If you report the rumor, you are getting it in front of people who have not yet seen it. If you don't, you're not providing facts, and in the absence of facts, you've got room for a lot of dangerous and incorrect speculation. So that tension, what you do between amplification and correction, that's where this week's paper starts, and the argument is pretty straightforward. If the misinformation starts and it spreads from a local level like it did in this case, the best way to fight it may not be to have a PolitiFact or a New York Times check it out. Instead, it might be better to have this kind of corrections come from the journalists who already live in the community where the claims are. What happened in Boone is not unique, but it is a useful example. So, in the research paper, the authors point out that today misinformation happens at a bunch of different levels. People can talk to each other in the grocery store face to face about a post they saw on Instagram that's also viewable by people across the world they'll never meet. We know that there are global misinformation issues. I'm recording this in mid March of 2026, and there was recently a big online rumor that the Prime Minister of Israel was dead. But misinformation can also be super local, showing up inside specific communities and getting passed around on things like messaging apps that can be really hard to see from the outside. Perot and Morris point out examples that show that kind of duality. On the global side, there's things like pictures showing space lasers causing Hawaii wildfires. This wasn't true, and was later shown to be misattributed photos from a SpaceX launch. On the local side, there have been rumors of things like people seeing killer clowns in wooded areas of Appalachia. When I was in college, there was a persistent rumor about a lizard man who lived in the woods in Lee County, South Carolina. These kind of rumors tap into local anxieties, but what connects them is not just that they're false, but that they work. They're viral. In some way, it seems plausible. And of course, that misinformation isn't necessarily just people being confused. Sometimes it's people who are trying to get paid for, engagement farming with false information. So that means that it's meant to be shareable so that someone can make money. So we have a structural problem here. It takes very little effort to make misinformation, but it takes a lot to check it. And there's not really a single institution that can handle that. Traditionally, the authors point out that there are two institutions that take on that role. Those are fact checkers and national media organizations. And here's where the paper gets really interesting. A lot of times we talk about fact checking as the best way to fight misinformation, but the authors suggest that this is misleading. It's almost as if we would say that misinformation and fact checking have equal power. And really, they don't. As we've talked about before on UnSpun, AI content generation has made it almost trivial to create really engaging fake news. Fact checkers have limited resources, and honestly, they just can't keep up. There's also a problem of trust. When people have already accepted some misinformation, it is really difficult for correct information to get them to change their mind. And sometimes this turns into them just not trusting the fact checker as having done careful and accurate work. It's also worth noting that fact checkers do make mistakes. And so when people who want to spread fake news celebrate those mistakes, it hurts the fact checker's credibility. So maybe national media outlets like big TV stations and newspapers aren't the answer. The authors argue that although their issues are different, they're still not going to be up to the task. These national organizations have to cover issues that matter to very large audiences. So this is major events, things everybody's talking about, things like national politics. But misinformation is not always a big story. Misinformation around small stories targeting small audiences is also important. And even if a national media outlet comes in to fact check a claim like a dispute in a local election, for example, they may not have the gravitas to deal in those local areas. They might talk about the issues in a different way. They don't know the players, and that makes their reporting seem less credible to the local people. So fundamentally, it's a mismatch. You can have very local, quick spreading, tailored fake news in local communities, but the institutions that might counter it tend to be slow and they tend to be concerned with bigger issues. If we have this mismatch of closeness and size, the answer may not be to keep expanding things like fact checkers. We might need to look at different parts of the news ecosystem. And it's the one that's always there in the places where the rumors are starting. So, what the authors are suggesting is not a new institution, but thinking about an old one in a new way. They argue that local journalism could be the most effective place to fight fake news. They describe it as a quote, mitigation hub. Now, I'm going to take a quick break, but when I come back, we will talk about the way the paper shows how local journalism has some of the best chance of fighting fake news. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Okay, we have looked at how the authors are looking at local fake news, like ICE being in a community, and how big fact checking organizations and national media don't effectively address this. Instead, the authors talk about the benefits of local journalists in fighting misinformation in their own communities. Here's some reasons. First, just the fact that local journalists are part of the places they report on. They live in the community. They know about community groups. They know how schools work and where you're going to find people on Sunday morning. It's really hard for people from the outside to get that kind of pulse of a community. Because they live in the community and they know the people, local journalists are a lot more able to recognize something if it just doesn't fit. There's also a question of access. Now, it's true that if CNN or the Washington Post calls the sheriff's office, they'll get a call back because of their name. But local journalists have more and more direct lines. They are better able to get people behind the scenes who can add context. They know who to call, they know which officials are very careful about the truth and which ones are more likely to grandstand. And that means that they can be both better and faster at verifying information. The third is what the authors describe as social cohesion. This is just trust. Although your local TV station may not have the same prestige as a Fox News or a CNN, it still matters. It helps to tell people locally what's important every day. So, because of that, local people are going to look to their local news when it's an issue that affects their own community. So, you can take these three factors and you see that there's kind of an information advantage for local journalists. They're not trying to do everything, but they are trying to do a good job for their people. And that means that they have an ability to be specific in a way that outsiders who come in just can't. But the authors point out that it's not necessarily easy. One obvious big problem is money. News deserts, places that are not served by any local news outlets, have been rapidly increasing. Those that are left often have tiny staff and very limited resources. And in a lot of cases, just the cost of creating local news has made it harder to serve local audiences, and that is a real issue. Another one is social pressure. While living in the community that you report on has some advantages, it also makes it complicated to be completely independent. Because some reporting has a personal cost, it can make a journalist reluctant to cover stories that are controversial. In places where the community is deeply divided, it can even be unsafe. Sometimes local journalists may feel tempted to censor themselves in order to avoid being harassed or even physically harmed. So, local journalism, not a perfect solution, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have merit to consider. Local journalism may not have enough resources, and at times the proximity that makes it stronger also makes it weaker. But it also has a unique ability to find, investigate, and debunk information in these local communities. So that's the center of argument of the paper. And now that takes us back to Boone. As the post about ice rage showed up on Instagram and Reddit, it started getting reinforced by repetition from the audience on social media. For the Watauga Democrat, it was an immediate problem, but there was no confirmation that raids actually happened. According to the research paper, the editor tried to verify the claim by contacting local authorities. And he found out that no, there were not actually ICE agents going door to door. Instead, there was one unrelated incident where someone who was already in police custody had been transferred to ICE. And that distinction is important because it separates what's really going on from what people are implying online. The article that the newspaper published shows that distinction. It doesn't dismiss the concern outright, and it doesn't ignore the broader national context of concern over immigration enforcement, but it also makes it clear that the specific rumor that's circulating, that ICE is actively doing raids in Boone, is just not supported by evidence. And so here you can see the role of local journalism. It's timely, it shows up soon after the posts do. It's specific to the exact claim that's being made, and it's local, right? It is talking about the sources that are directly knowledgeable about the situation. But at the same time, it's also careful. Reporting on the rumor carries its own risk. If they repeat the claim, even while they're debunking it, it does extend its reach. But if you don't report it, you leave it open to speculation. So, what the paper points out is that local journalism did manage to navigate that tension, and it addressed it at the place where it was actually spreading. Now, there's a second case study in the paper which moves from a single newsroom to a network. This happened overseas in Germany, where there is an initiative called Corrective Locale, which gives a different model for how local journalism can respond. It is a local part of a larger nonprofit investigative organization, Corrective, which is kind of like a PolitiFact. The idea was to connect local journalists in different places so that they could share resources and findings. Now, this is important because, as we talked about before, one of the things that affects local journalism is just its capacity. They often don't have the time or the people to do large scale investigations. So, a network like Corrective helps to create that shared infrastructure. When local journalists can access this centralized data, they can connect their local reporting to these broader national issues. There was an example in the paper about a meeting between members of the AfD party, a far right party that's becoming more powerful in Germany, and other far right figures. The rumor was that they were discussing large scale deportations in Germany. The case is interesting because it's not just the investigation, but what happens afterwards. Local journalists across the country were able to take in these centralized findings and then see how these ideas were showing up in their own regions. So, this helps contextualize this national issue for a bunch of different local audiences in different locations. So, this is a little bit different from the Boone example. In Boone, local journalism shines because it's specific and can answer the question quickly. In Corrective, the strength is coordination. Local knowledge still matters, a lot, but it's also supported by shared resources. So, the research paper authors say this is suggestive of even bigger possibilities. Local journalism could choose to be both small and local and well connected. And based on these cases, the paper has these two suggestions for how to make local journalism even better at responding to misinformation. First, is what the authors described as reporting, quote, in kind. Although information is spreading on social media platforms, the response is in a traditional news article. If a correction doesn't show up in a place where misinformation is, it's possible that people who are exposed to the misinformation will never see that correction. So the authors recommend expanding traditional formats by doing the fact checks on the platforms where the misinformation shows up. So this can be things like sharing links to the article on the social media platforms. The corrective case demonstrates the second recommendation, which is collaboration. Local newsrooms can get more capacity by joining together. This doesn't have to be just networks of local organizations, because national organizations could also help by supporting local reporting or sharing local reporting rather than trying to come in and do the same reporting themselves. One really interesting thing from the paper is the perspective that they have on the misinformation itself. A lot of times, it's easy to think of fake news spreading outward like a balloon, but the authors describe it as something that also grows inward, like a weed that works its way into specific communities and intertwines its fake messages with elements of truth. And if you look at it that way, to combat it, you have to look at the root level. If misinformation is local, then local journalism can be an effective response. Because of their trust and their proximity, local reporters have an advantage. If scale is a problem, collaborations can help add capacity. But there are some questions that are left. We've talked about a few of these already. The first is financial stability, the second is the growth of news deserts, and the third is the social dynamics of trying to cover powerful people in your community who could affect your life. So what do we do with this? The research paper is not trying to claim that local journalism is going to fix misinformation. What it suggests is more specific. In a media environment where you have community-level misinformation, community-level response needs to be a part of the answer. If you see a claim about something happening in a specific place, maybe it's an immigration raid in a neighborhood, maybe it's an illness that's spreading, it may not be the national outlet that has the best chance of confirming it. It can be that small newsroom. While you were watching events from far away, like many people were in Minneapolis earlier this year, you can often get the best news from the local newsroom. The question we still have to figure out is whether that newsroom will still be there and whether it will have the resources to respond when it matters. That's why I subscribe to my local newspaper. Thanks for coming to this episode of the UnSpun Journal Club. Stay sharp, everyone. Thanks for getting unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
Tired of sugar-coated news and corporate spin? Check out The Nicole Sandler Show. Speaking truth to power with the irreverence it deserves. Smart, fearless, and just the right amount of snark. Nicole breaks down the headlines, exposes the hypocrisy, and talks with the people working for real change. Weekdays at 3 Eastern, noon Pacific on Progressive Voices, NicoleSandler.com, Substack, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't just get the news, get the truth.